So as I was preparing stories for this day up in Duncan, I realized that I am drawn to stories that have fathers in them, about fathers who hurt their daughters. And I thought to myself, maybe you're working through some parts of your own life. Here's another story about a father and a beautiful daughter. This story is from old Japan, and there was a wealthy tradesman who had a beautiful daughter named Akiko, and she was as kind and generous as she was beautiful. Now, sadly, when she was a young woman, her mother died, and her father, the tradesman, remarried. But he remarried someone who was mean and sharp-tongued. And right from the get-go, she was filled with envy of beautiful Yukiko and how kind and generous she was and how everyone else loved her so much. She always had a bowl of rice with fish for beggars who came to the door. She always showed them kindness and generosity. But this wicked woman couldn't stand her, and she tried to pile on all kinds of household chores and tasks that took her from dawn to dusk. But no matter what she did, Akiko always had a smile the next morning. And she just carried on, and she tried to overcome this, and was always trying to please this stepmother of hers. There were many people who came to the house and needed their help. As I was saying, she helped these beggars. Well, that just enraged the stepmother, and she said to Akiko's father, "Your daughter, she is going to give everything away. If it was her money, she might not, but it's not, so she just gives it away. And we're going to have lines of beggars here, and all your customers are going to turn away and go elsewhere. Now, is that what you want?" She was always trying to put in a wedge between Akiko and her father. Now, whenever she berated her, Akiko was the perfect Japanese girl, and she never protested or defended herself. She always bowed her head and stood there and took whatever the stepmother had to say. And tears would well up in her eyes, and she would just try to hide them. Now, the stepmother, she said to herself, "I don't know what it is about Akiko, but I just can't stand anything about her. I am so jealous of her. I just hate her, how beautiful she is and how good she is, and how her father loves her. But I must get rid of her. I must find a way to turn her out. I just can't stand this. I can't live with it any longer." And finally, one day, she had her chance. It was New Year's Day, and Akiko served last year's rice for their special New Year's Day feast. She immediately ran to her husband and she said, "Do you know what Akiko has done? Now she has served last year's rice for our feast. The God of happiness will be angry with us, and we will live in shame and have bad luck for the entire year. Now you must send her away. It is the only thing to do." So sadly, her father could think of no way out, and Akiko was turned out into the night. It was just starting to snow. She had on but a light quilted jacket over her kimono, and she headed down the street and thought, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" Well, she stopped in at various shops to see if anyone needed someone to help there so that she could work and earn enough money for some food. but nobody needed her, and all the people were thinking, what is this young woman out on the street for, looking for work? She comes from a wealthy family. And they shook their heads, but no one offered to help her. She finally began to feel the pangs of hunger, not to mention the cold. And so she finally stopped at an inn and knocked timidly on the door. The door was answered by the innkeeper. "Yes? What do you want?" he said unkindly. "Oh, kind sir, may I sell you my jacket in exchange for some rice and fish, some warm food?" Well, the innkeeper snatched the jacket from her and said, "Well, I will have to sell it first to see what it's worth." And he took the jacket and he slammed the door in her face. Well, Akiko waited there in her thin kimono and feeling the cold, and she tried to think of that warm bowl of food, and she began to dream about perhaps finding a place to work in a wealthy home where she could look after the house and arrange flowers. She tried to think of all these beautiful thoughts, but finally she just got so cold and hungry that she knocked on the door again, and the innkeeper was back, and he said, "Oh, it's you." And she said, "If you haven't sold my jacket yet, may I please come in and wait for you while you find out what it's worth?" But the innkeeper was done with her, and he said, "You are nothing but a nuisance. You will deter my customers. Be gone before I turn the dogs on you." And poor Akiko ran off in shame, and she just wanted to get away as fast as she could and out of that town. She thought, "I would rather die in the forest than in this town where I lived." And so she made her way to the forest. She said to herself, "I've heard that wolves will kill people. Well, that's what I would prefer, to be killed by a wolf than to die of hunger in my own town." And she grabbed an old burlap sack from a garbage heap on her way and wrapped it around herself and went into the deep woods. And she walked and walked, and it had begun to snow, and it was cold, but there was a certain calmness and peace that she felt in the forest. And she just thought, this is the place where I'm going to end my life. And she waited and waited for that wolf to come and probably kill her. And soon she heard a growling in the trees, and a large wolf emerged, and she stood before him trembling, bowed her head and said, "Just kill me and get it over with." But the wolf spoke and said, "I'm not going to kill you. I don't eat real human beings." "Well, what do you mean? Of course I'm a human being." "Ah," said the wolf, "there are human beings, but there are real human beings. There are human beings who are bad, unkind people, and they are people like yourself, real human beings, full of kindness and generosity." Akiko shook her head. She couldn't believe what was happening. She said, "Well, how do you know this?" "I have magic eyelashes," said the wolf. And he plucked some out and said, "I'll give you some of my eyelashes so that you will be able to tell when you look at people who are the true human beings. Now you take those into town and you look at people through those and you'll see what I mean." Well, Akiko felt some sense of hope at last. Dawn was coming, so she made her way to the next town. There was no way she was going back to her own town. And it was morning when she got there, and she planted herself in the town square. And she looked around at the people going by, and they looked normal enough. She saw a woman coming by, elegantly dressed. She thought, well, perhaps I'll look through those lashes and see what I can see. So she arranged the lashes amongst her own. And she looked at the woman. And she almost burst out laughing because that woman's head now looked like a chicken's head, jutting forward, beady eyes looking this way and that. And many of the people behind her looked like, other animals, mice, even fish, but not a single human being. And then a man elegantly dressed. Why, he had a pig's head and a snout and black piggy eyes peering about at people. And then she saw an inn door open and the innkeeper poke his head out and look to the left and the right. And his head was like a sly fox. And he squinted his eyes and looked at people. Oh my goodness, this was so revealing. Now she understood why she was treated so badly when her father had turned her out, and none of the people would have anything to do with her. They weren't true human beings. But would she ever find one? Finally, towards the end of the day, a young man was walking by, and she noticed how handsome he was. But then she thought, he has a human head. He looks like a human being. I think I'm going to follow him. And so she did, and he continued to look like a human being. He was heading sort of out of town, and eventually she caught up with him, and he said to her, I've noticed you've been following me. Well, she told her story as to why she was following him and said, you're the only true human being I've seen today. And they kind of laughed at the story. They fell into conversation, and soon he said, come back with me to my little home and I'll feed you and you can sleep there until you figure out what you're going to do. And so they went to his small cabin in the woods, and true to his word, he fed her and gave her a place to sleep. And, this went on for a number of days and weeks, months. She looked after the house while he went into town to work. He was a woodworker. Well, after a while, they decided to start a business together. And they turned the little house into an inn, and it was doing well. And they eventually realized that they were in love, and they got married. And Akiko now had her own business to run, and she could decide whether she wanted to look after beggars, and she did, of course. She always had a bowl of rice for beggars going by, a bowl of rice with fish and vegetables, and she did the same for passing monks. Well, one day when she was out in the woods gathering edible food for their inn, like berries, roots, special plants, she discovered a stream that magically ran with beautiful, delicious rice wine. So she was able to bring that back regularly, and that boosted their prosperity. They were doing very well with their inn. Now one day, a beggar came by. He was an old man. And of course, she gave him the food that he needed. And as he sat at the table, tears were running down his face. And he said to her, I once had a daughter like you, so kind, so generous. But I turned her out, and now I don't know whether she's alive or dead. And this is my just punishment for what I did to her. And of course Akiko looked more closely at him and realized that it was her own father. And so she embraced him, and he was overjoyed and begged her forgiveness. And of course, she did forgive him. And Eventually, he came to live with them and helped to look after the grandchildren and to tell the story of the wolf's eyelashes to his grandchildren. That's the story of the wolf's eyelashes.